Back in 1992, when I was a sophomore in high school, I didn't work the usual fast food or retail jobs like most of my friends. Instead, I worked under the table doing hands-on jobs like construction, demolition, flooring, and auto mechanics. Since I started at 14, I was only called in when needed, mostly evenings and weekends, which worked out for both me and the people I worked for. One of my main contacts specialized in remodeling restaurants, bars, and retail spaces, jobs that had to be done after hours. I was usually left alone to do demolition work while the skilled laborers handled the rebuilding. I didn't mind. I was just the tear-out guy. But I got paid well, sometimes more in one night than my friends made in a whole week flipping burgers. One Friday, my boss called me up about a job for the next morning. He told me to bring plenty of food and drinks since there was nothing nearby. That wasn't unusual. I always packed a small cooler with sodas, Gatorade, chips, and sandwiches. I could eat a whole pizza back then and still burn it off. Since I didn't have a car or a license yet, my boss picked me up early Saturday morning. As we drove, I wasn't really paying attention to where we were going. I was too busy talking about cars since I was saving up to buy an old muscle car to rebuild. The drive was long, and eventually we left the main highway, turning onto smaller, isolated roads. He handed me a big jug of water from his truck, saying the house didn't have running water. That was my first clue that this job was different. When we finally arrived, the house was in the middle of nowhere. And I mean nowhere. It was one of those old desert ranch-style homes, far from any neighbors. My boss was in a rush to drop off my tools before heading to another job site. He gave me a list of tasks: tear out all the flooring, gut the kitchen and bathrooms, remove any leftover furniture, and told me he'd be back around 5 or 6 p.m. Then he drove off, leaving me completely alone. As soon as I stepped inside, I got a weird feeling. Now, I was used to working alone, even at night, so it wasn't the solitude that got to me. It was the house itself. It felt off. The air was musty and unnaturally cool, the kind of cool that gives you goosebumps. The interior looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1960s. Dark green carpet that looked like flattened broccoli, pine wood paneling on the walls, old lace curtains, an avocado green stove and sink. The closets were still filled with stuff, including a bunch of dusty stuffed animals that had probably been sitting there for 30 years. I shrugged it off and got to work. I had an old battery-powered radio that barely picked up any stations, but it was better than silence. I started hauling junk out, tearing up the flooring, and demolishing the kitchen. Surprisingly, everything came apart easily, almost too easily. By the afternoon, I had finished everything on my list. Around 4 p.m., I realized I was running low on drinks. I had already gone through the jug of water my boss gave me, plus everything in my cooler. The dry desert air had sucked the moisture right out of me. But no big deal. I figured my ride would be there soon. Except, he didn't show up. By 6 p.m., the sun was going down and the temperature was dropping fast. I threw on my flannel, but it wasn't enough. That's when I realized I had no way to contact anyone. No cell phone, this was the early 90s, no electricity, no landline. I climbed onto the roof to see if I could spot any lights in the distance. There were a few houses way down the dirt road, but they were all dark. My best bet was to hike to the closest one and hope someone was home. But when I got there, it was empty. Another abandoned house. It hit me then. No one knows where I am. My family wouldn't expect me home until Sunday night, and my boss probably assumed the other crew had picked me up. If no one came for me, I'd be stuck out here until morning. By 8 p.m., it was pitch black. The only light came from the moon. My radio batteries were dying, leaving me in silence. I found an old chair and sat by the fireplace, trying to keep warm. That's when I started hearing things. footsteps, rustling outside. Then, whispers. I stood up and yelled, "Hello?" A loud crash came from the back of the house. My stomach dropped. There was no way anyone else was out here. Right? I ran outside, grabbing my heavy pry bar from the tool pile. My heart was pounding. I thought I saw movement near the trees, but it was too dark to tell. I kept moving to stay warm, but every noise had me on edge. My mind started playing tricks on me. I kept thinking about the stories I'd heard, about bodies buried in the desert, strange cults, and people vanishing without a trace. Then, at around midnight, I glanced back at the house, and I saw it. A shadow. A human-shaped figure moved from the kitchen toward the hallway. I knew no one was in there. I stumbled backward, tripping over debris. As I scrambled to get up, I saw headlights coming down the dirt road. My boss. I ran toward his truck as fast as I could. He got out, looking confused. "What the hell are you doing?" I was too relieved to be mad. I just asked, "What happened? Why didn't anyone come get me?" Turns out, he thought the other crew was picking me up, and they thought he was. It wasn't until late that night that they realized no one had actually come for me. He felt bad and promised to pay me for the extra hours. As we drove back, he handed me a Coke, and I downed it in one gulp. When we hit civilization, he took me to a fast food drive-thru, and I ate like I'd never eaten before. On the way home, I asked about the house. He just shrugged. "No idea, just another remodel job." But I knew that place wasn't normal. After that night, I made sure to always bring extra batteries, a flashlight, and way more water. Because next time, I might not be so lucky.